So, a serious question. Could the American Republic fall the same way the Republic did in Rome? Rome continued as a country for 1,400 years after it ceased to be a republic. Is that what's going on here? Check it out. Leave your comments. Share it with your friends, please. Ding the bell and subscribe to our channel. How our republic could die in the age of Trump, in a stunning parallel to the fall of Rome, is the title. And, you know, what I'm pointing out here, and I think this is really worth pointing out because I think most Americans, you know, frankly, didn't study civics, and so they don't get all this stuff, but it's pretty important stuff, is that the only branch of government that actually has legal enforcement power, that has the power of the police, is the executive branch. It's given, you know, the Constitution divides our government into three parts: Articles 1, Article 2, Article 3, right? Articles 1, 2, and 3. Article 1 is Congress. Congress has no police power. They have, you know, they've got the sergeant at arms, basically. They can control their own chamber, but they have no meaningful police power. That's Article 1. Article 3 are the courts. The courts have no police power. They can make court orders all day long, bang their gavels, yell and scream, but if the Article 2 branch of government, the executive branch of government, the president and the agencies under the president, all of the police agencies, the FBI and whatnot, all of the military agencies, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and, you know, if they don't go along with an enforcement, then it doesn't happen. And, you know, like I said, I think most Americans don't realize this because they never, you know, most Americans, or at least most Americans under 50, never studied civics. Alexander Hamilton laid this out in Federalist Number 78. You know, he said, you know, the courts, the legislature has the power to appropriate and spend money, but they do not have the power of the police. The courts have the power to decide what is legal and what is not, or what is the law, or what, you know, to rule on things, but they don't have the power to enforce their decisions. Only the president, only the executive has the power to actually enforce. So let me just go through this thought experiment with you, and I'd like to ask you where you think this might end. We start out, Congress opens impeachment hearings, which gives Congress even more power to demand things, to subpoena people. They can say to Don McGahn, you can try to ignore this. Right now, the Justice Department is saying McGahn can't testify because it has nothing to do with a legitimate legislative purpose. Well, the Constitution makes it very clear that impeachment is a legitimate purpose of Congress. So if the Judiciary Committee opens an impeachment hearing, and they say, okay, Don McGahn, you have to come and testify, and McGahn still refuses to testify, then they go to the courts, right? McGahn and Trump are refusing to, McGahn's refusing to testify, Trump is refusing to turn over documents. Just like Nixon initially refused to turn over the White House tapes, said, nope, that's privileged. So then it goes to the courts. In fact, right now, Trump's taxes are going to the D.C. Circuit Court. The chief judge there is Merrick Garland. This is going to be interesting. But anyhow, it goes to the courts. And it works its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says to the president, just like they did with Nixon, you've got to let McGahn testify. This is an impeachment hearing. You can't say no. And so Congress holds a hearing, and McGahn doesn't show up. So Congress now has a legal court order from the Supreme Court saying McGahn has to testify. They send that legal court order over to the White House and say, you must use your police powers to transport McGahn to Congress and have him testify. Right? Use the Secret Service, use the Capitol Police, use the military, use whatever you want. You've got all the police powers. And the guy who would enforce that would be the head of the Justice Department, because that's where all the police powers are, right? And that's Bill Barr. And Bill Barr says, by the way, there's a precedent for this. As Andrew Jackson said twice during his presidency, Once with the Trail of Tears, when the Supreme Court ruled against him and said, you must stop the Trail of Tears, and he said, tough luck. He said, Roger Taney has made his decision, let him enforce it. Roger Taney, at the time, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he did the Trail of Tears anyway. He completely ignored the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court has no power to enforce their actions. And then the Supreme Court again ruled that Andrew Jackson couldn't end the second bank of the United States. And Jackson said, I'm going to do it. And he pulled the charter on the second bank, and the second bank shut down, and we slid into the worst, deepest, and longest depression in the history of the United States because Andrew Jackson defied the Supreme Court, but he just said, I'm not going to do it. So Congress holds the hearings. They submit the lawful court order from the Supreme Court to the executive branch. Trump gives it to Bill Barr. Bill Barr says, I'm not going to force McGahn to testify. And Congress is sitting there on their thumbs. And, you know, Trump says to Congress, says to Jerry Nadler, okay, enforce your own decision. Good luck, which is essentially what he's been saying all along. So then Congress issues a contempt citation and says, you know, Don McGahn has to go to jail if he won't come and testify. The contempt citation goes to the courts. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, yep, Don McGahn's in contempt of Congress. Throw him in jail. They say that to the president, to the executive branch. Hey, it's your branch. He worked for you. He's refusing to testify under your orders. So you have to put him in one of our jails. We got all kinds of federal prisons. The president runs those. And the president says, no, I'm not going to do it. What do we do? I mean, at that point, have we become a full-blown strongman form of government? Have we lost our democracy? See, the simple fact of the matter is, as I point out in this article that, as I said, is all over the internet right now, is that Congress and the courts really do not have the power to enforce their own laws that Congress makes or rulings that the courts make. The only agency that can enforce those, that can use the power, the literal force power of government, the power to use handcuffs and guns and jail cells, the only branch that has that power is the executive branch, the Article II branch. And if they refuse to use that power, what do we do? Now, they have refused to use that power in the past. This happened, you know, Harriet Miers was supposed to testify before Congress when George W. Bush was president. He said, no, she's not going to testify. They took it to court. The court said, yes, she has to testify. Bush ignored it. That term of Congress expired. It expires every two years. And this current term of Congress will expire at the end of 2020, next year. And when that term of Congress expired, their order expired. Their demand that Harriet Miers come and testify. And so it became moot. Bush won. Same thing happened in the Fast and Furious investigation, where Eric Holder testified before Congress 7 times, turned over hundreds of thousands of documents, and Congress still wanted him to come back. And at that point, he was like, okay, this is just harassment from the Republicans in Congress. I'm not going to do it. They held him in contempt. The courts sustained it. But by that time, a new Congress had been installed and the old stuff was gone. So have we, you know, it's like we've been on this road for a while, getting here. But if this becomes totally obvious, now you want to take this a step farther, a step even more extreme? The president refuses, Trump refuses to allow McGahn to testify. And it could be anybody, by the way. I'm using McGahn as just an example. Refuses to turn over his tax returns. Pick your you know, poison, as it were. Trump refuses to do it. The Supreme Court orders it. Trump says, no, I ain't going to do it. So the Congress says, okay, we're going to impeach you for that. That was Article 3 of the Nixon impeachments, is that he defied a subpoena. And so they hold hearings and they impeach him in the House of Representatives, and it goes to the Senate. And let's say at this point, it's so obvious what Trump is doing, and it's so disgusting and so horrifying that a couple of dozen Republicans in the Senate say, okay, we're with you. And they convict him in the Senate and say, sorry, you got to leave office. And Trump at that point says, I'm not going. And he turns to his own military and says, you guys with me or not? What happens? I mean, the last time something close to that last scenario that I just described happened was when Abraham Lincoln refused to enforce the Supreme Court order by Roger Taney, again, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in Dred Scott. Dred Scott, the Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, said that black people are slaves everywhere in the United States, not just slaves, property. And Abraham Lincoln became president, and he said, I am not going to enforce that Supreme Court decision. And a bunch of people in the South said, well, if you're not going to enforce that decision, then we're not going to go along with you. A bunch of the military in the South, the southern states themselves, every state has a militia. It's called a National Guard now. They were called militias back then. It's the same thing. And the state militias and the state governments in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, within a month or so of Abraham Lincoln becoming president, as I recall, I'm not the Civil War historian at that level of granularity, said, okay, we're pulling out of the Republic. And we fought a war for several years and killed 600,000 Americans in the process through this, because of this, right? In part because the president refused to enforce a Supreme Court order.